Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I am sweating buckets today. It is midsummer, and my only AC unit is in the upstairs. So, regardless of that, it is lists time. This is the starter lists for destruction video. I'm going to go through all of the destruction factions in Warcry to give you at least 3 lists to play in all of your games. This is post the 2021 that actually came out in 2022 Tome of Champions, and quite a few things have changed since last year's version of this. So as always for these videos, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on the structure. I'm going to start with a budget list. I'll generally always choose a solid list over a dysfunctional one if it's even remotely close in price. I'll be looking for, really just looking for the cheapest thing, but I want something that's actually going to keep you stuck into the game, right? Sometimes you build a list and you play it and it technically works under the rules, but it's not really functional in the game, and then maybe it ruins you on the game, or maybe it hooks you, but then you realize you just have to get a whole new list anyway. So I don't want that to happen to you. So if 2 lists are pretty close in price, but one is significantly more functional in game, I'll choose that one. The definition of budget also here, really relative by faction. Some factions are very hard to collect for cheap, and some are really easy. In fact, Destruction has a few that are really friendly to anyone trying to get into the game on a budget, and so that makes this video really exciting in my opinion. I will only quote eBay for things if they're just like everywhere on the platform. So if it's something that you'd have to hunt for even just like a couple weeks, I'm probably not going to be quoting it here. It would need to be something where any given day you could go onto eBay and find it for this given price. That's when I'll use eBay for prices. Otherwise, I'm just going to use MSRP. Then I'm going to go into kind of more competitive stuff, right? So I'm going to talk about first things that are kind of balanced competitive wise for the Tome of Champions and the missions that are in there. That's what a lot of people are using for their events nowadays. That's kind of the most exciting new mission packs. Though a lot of those generally work in base game missions or Red Harvest missions as well. You can check out my Lessons from Adepticon video. It's one of the videos that I'm most proud of on this channel, and it kind of talks about how I arrived at this template of kind of a threat in every deployment zone and then as much chaff as you can get to, and sort of why I think that that's the way to approach the Tome of Champions right now. If a faction can't actually do this template, and there's a lot of factions out there in the game that don't really fit well with this template, then I'll skip this and do 2 of these kind of other lists, or kind of wildcard lists. For those, it's going to be, first, if we have a proven tournament list that just doesn't fit the above template, it'll go there, right? Because there are really solid ways to play that don't necessarily fit that template. If the faction, so for example, has like a really good swarm list or a really all elite list, I'll put it there. If neither of the above are true, I'm generally going to default to putting a list built around a really cool ability, something that I find noteworthy or compelling or fun. I think a lot of people loved some of the meme lists that I put in my first starter list video, and the lists in these series are going to be a little bit more serious than they were last year, but there are still going to be some meme lists out there for people to have fun with. So before we get into the list building, I want to talk about the top allies in Destruction. In general, right, I think it's more productive to talk about the allies separately and then just talk about how you could put them in these lists. Almost every list is going to be more powerful with one of the allies on this board. So rather than just list the same lists, essentially just port it over to each faction, I'm just going to talk about what we've got here. Generally, when you're looking to add an ally to your list, you're looking for one of these 4 things. So the first one being movement. And Destruction has access to a really solid movement ability called Wa. Any fan of Warhammer will know about this. But the 2 real attractive pieces in Destruction that have access to the Wa ability are, in my opinion, the War Chanter out of Ironjawz, because it also has an attack buff for just a double. So you can be using Wa in the early turns to get into position, and then it's still an important piece for its abilities later on too. And then I would go with the Savage Boss Maniac. Now that's a boar riding leader just rides a little pig. It comes out of the Boar Boy kit from Bonesplitterz. And what I think is really good about it is it's really fast on its own, and it gives this buff. So on round 1, you would wah, and then you would move it really far, and maybe it wouldn't be using wah in later rounds, but the sheer projection you have from that is pretty incredible. What you can do for a faction like Kruleboyz by allying in a Savage Boss Maniac is really, really powerful. So just the way you can get into position but then be fast on its own, and it's a reasonable damage piece too. So if you're trying to boost your movement, those are the 2 fighters that I would take a look at for literally any faction on this video. The other thing you're often looking for is just like one sort of power projection piece that can just make the entire game revolve around it. I call a lot of these dragons, but there's also sort of one of the best artillery pieces is also in destruction. So the Squig Hopper boss is an incredibly fast thing that does a ton of damage. It's sort of a proven terror in tournaments already. Definitely try it out in your lists. The other one is the Thunder Fist. The Thunder Fist is incredible at killing chaff units. It can often mow through 2 or 3 of them in a round, and that can be really valuable anytime that you're expecting your opponents to be bringing just lots and lots of bodies. Disruption is often something that you're looking for in an ally. I don't think the disruption options are as good as some of what the other Grand Alliances will get. Certainly Chaos and Order both have much better options for disruption than Destruction does. But that said, Manok the Cunnin plus Torka Toughskull is a reasonable combo to bring in. You could bring Shank in there too. The Underworld's allying rules are pretty forgiving when it comes to if you bring the leader, you get to bring the leader's minions. And that lets you bring in Torka's net, so you can get a net into factions that don't have it. It's also worth noting that the Swamp Kala Shaman and the Wurgog Prophet have AoE debuffs. I don't think those are powerful enough to bring them in over any of these other options above them here, but worth thinking about. The other thing, the final thing that you usually look for in an ally is force multiplication. Order has really good options for this. Destruction, not so much. However, one that's really notable is the Brew Git. You can use wild dice on any kind of 5 or 6 to get +3 attacks, which is pretty incredible on certain fighters. So the Brew Git is definitely worth looking at. I don't think right now that the Brew Git is really a part of any competitive lists, or at least is the most competitive thing you can do. However, it is very good, and it's the kind of thing where you should just always have it in your back pocket in case you see a new thing, maybe that someone's never discovered before, that can be really powerful. I know at least one person has done pretty well with pairing a Brew Git with Snirk Sour Tongue, which is a Gloomspite Gitz piece. Now that's not an ally rule thing, those are both in the same faction, but it's just a pretty sweet little ability that you can, maybe get some mileage out of that hasn't really been discovered yet. So that would be the sort of allies that you can use in Destruction. Again, Squig Hopper bosses, Thunder Fists, and Savage Boss Maniacs here. Those 3 are really the standouts, and almost any Destruction list is going to be more powerful bringing in or just making sure it has access to one of those 3 pieces. So the first faction I'm going to get into is the Bonesplitterz. Now, the budget way to get into Bonesplitterz is just the basic Savage Orc box. MSRP right now has gone up a little bit on it. It's 60 now. But it gets you all of the options, all of the foot options that Bonesplitterz have access to, which is pretty nice. So you can go with a Savage Moorboy boss, who is a really solid, just kind of basic foot hero. Then the Savage Arrow boss is a sort of great example of something that can just pick off 1 or 2 fighters that are on 1 or 2 health, sort of here and there. So even though it's not the most efficient damage option, or sorry, most sort of outputting damage option, it helps you with your overall damage efficiency because you don't have to waste bigger attack activations on taking out fighters with just 1 wound left, and it can project that sort of ability to be efficient all across the board. And it's also just got a great defensive profile for 120 points. So something like a all of the hunter missions where you have to take out a leader or a full deployment group, and if the Savage Arrow boss is in that group, it's like it can hang out in the back, have things kind of body blocking for it, and then even once they do get to it, it's very difficult to take out, which can be pretty valuable. So then you would have 2 of the Savage Big Stabbas. This is the absolutely ridiculous piece, which is just 2 little Bonesplitterz standing there holding one giant spear. 2-person spears were a thing in medieval combat, but they were not used the way the Bonesplitterz are using this one. So it looks kind of ridiculous, but it's not got bad stats. You know, a lot of Bonesplitterz players swear by it because it sort of does a lot of damage for how much it costs, and it's sort of reasonably hard to kill, and so it's just a nice sort of big threat piece. I would want to go with 2 Morboy Bone Totem Bearers. These are the regular Morboys, but with the sort of banner piece, which gives them 3-inch range instead of 1, and they only cost 5 more points than the regular Morboy does, which is a great deal. And that's the only difference in their stat, is that extra 2 inches of reach, but that's a huge difference for just 5 points. Finally, I'd round the list out with just a Savage Orc with the Champa and Bone Shield. Just kind of one basic fighter. Bonesplitterz don't really have great chaff options, but Savage Orcs can at least, you know, be the thing that costs the least to kind of fill out these warbands. This list, you know, in the early days of Warcry, people would, you know, you couldn't bump into anyone on the internet without someone telling you that this box was the best way to get into Warcry. I don't agree at all. I don't think that was ever true, and it's definitely not true now, but it is solid. And this will give you a box that plays very close and balanced games with out-of-the-box Warcry warbands, so things like, you know, your Untamed Beasts, your Unmade, your Splintered Fang, stuff like that. You'll play very close games here. A lot of those will sort of outpace Bonesplitterz once you tune them up. But that's okay. I mean, you know, you'll get to prove everyone wrong who says that the Warcry bespoke factions can't compete with the AOS ones, because I think, you know, this box will give you something that's very balanced with them. If I was going to build sort of more competitively towards the Tome of Champions, I would start with the Savage Boss Maniac. I would say that's the one piece in Bonesplitterz that is sort of a really big league fighter, something that really adds a lot to your warband. So I would never leave home without one of them. And then I would still have 2 Savage Big Stabbas, just as, you know, that's how you fill out the template, with having at least 1 threat in each deployment group this way. Then I would still have a Savage Arrow Boss. Then I would have 3 of the Savage Orcs with sort of Spear and Bone Shield. So, you know, you can make this list with just the Orc box that I talked about before, plus just like a Boar Boy that you kind of fancy up. So there's kind of really easy conversion opportunities there, again, for doing this on a budget. This is kind of sort of the most close to the template you can build. Another thing you can do is kind of go more out of underworlds. So the Savage Boss Maniac would still be included, and you would still have the Savage Arrow Boss. Again, I'm sounding like a broken record, but those are really the 2 best leaders that you can get into. Then I would play Toothdaga and Wallop the Skull. I think those 2 give you pretty significant upsides compared to the regular Bonesplitterz of the same size, right? Toothdaga versus a Morboy, you're getting a little bit extra damage and 1 more health for the same price. And then I would have, rounding that out, with 2 Morboys with the Bone Totem Bearers for that extra 3-inch reach, and then just 2 regular Savage Orcs with the Spear for the reach as well. So this is kind of a list that's really good at keeping your opponent at arm's length. And in general, just these new Underworlds warbands, much better sculpts than the basic Bonesplitterz. The Bonesplitterz sculpts are pretty old, but even beyond that, the stats are a little better there too. If you want to be a little bit more fluffy, you can drop the Savage Arrow Boss and the Bone Totems for Hedraka and Dako Sharpsticka. The Underworld's warband is kind of interesting because I think those 2 are much weaker than the baseline Bonesplitterz stuff, and Toothdaga and Wallop the Skull are much stronger than the baseline Bonesplitterz stuff. So, you can make your own kind of business decision about whether you want to play all 4 of them or just the 2 strong ones. Overall, I would say competitively, Bonesplitterz are pretty weak. I'm not a believer in really any of their fighters other than the boar boss. Now the two fighters I talked about that come in Underworlds are legitimately pretty solid. The issue is, when your best 2 new units are kind of mid-sized, small, not the most impactful things, it's helping your sort of the amount of value you're getting. It's helping the kind of they're marginal upgrades is what I'm talking about. So in general, I would not suggest Bonesplitterz for anyone who's trying to get really competitive. However, casually, they're great, right? Because each of these boxes gives you a ton of options per box. They've got multiple leaders with kind of interesting things to build around. I mentioned the Wargog Prophet in the Allies section, but you can absolutely build lists around it for Bonesplitterz for casual play. Obviously that boar boss is really sweet. And the fact that you don't really have good chaff options, that your rank and file troops are just not very points efficient, that's not going to matter as much in casual or narrative play, and so you can really get a lot of mileage out of Bonesplitterz. So definitely, if you're interested in them and you don't care about how strong your warband is, definitely go for it. But otherwise, if you're kind of interested in competitive play, I would stay away from Bonesplitterz. Ironjawz. The single box ways to build them don't really work out that well. So for example, Brutes plus a War Chanter comes out to about $85 still, and it's reasonable, but it only comes up to 955 points, and you're going to notice that when you're playing. Just having 5 Brutes and a War Chanter is not going to feel quite as strong. So you're probably better off with the Start Collecting. It's an incredible box for Age of Sigmar, even though it's not sort of that price efficient for Warcry. But it does give you a Gorgrunta boss with Choppa. That thing's really strong. Gives you a War Chanter. You could have 5 Ardboys. Those kind of piggyback off the War Chanter's movement ability. And you can get a really solid start to Ironjawz that way. 7 fighters is hard to get put on the table with Ironjawz. You do make some sacrifices there. Ardboys, I think, based on some of the sort of points adjustments that other things in Ironjawz have gotten, Ardboys sort of point for point aren't as efficient as I would like, but it's still really solid. And again, this is an incredible box if you're wanting to collect a lot of Ironjawz. Now, if I was going to play them in a tournament, there's a couple ways I would do it. One would be to kind of lean on the War Chanter quite a bit. The other would be actually to use a lot of the Underworld stuff that they've got. Morgok is kind of an upgrade to a regular brute boss where the extra points really feel worth it for the extra damage you get. Thug is a really solid upgrade for the regular brute. And then I would include a brute with Gorhaka, that's the spear option, and then a regular Ardboy. And then I would have Basha, who for 5 more points gives you more damage and 1 more wound. I think it's a really nice trade-off there for just fitting in most lists. And then just 1 regular Gorgrunta. The way I like to kind of set these up is so that making sure that the Gorgrunta is kind of off in one deployment zone on its own, so that you have speed in multiple places, right? Because with Ironjawz, the name of the game with them is having Wa active at all times. That's the big movement buff that they get. So, I would surround Morgok with at least a couple friends and just kind of move forward with that, so that at least 2 of my 3 deployment zones have really solid mobility to them. You can actually make a really solid sort of facsimile of this list if you reduce Morgok to the 230 point Boss Claw Brute, and then you drop down Basha to a regular Ardboy. That gives you enough points to upgrade Thug to the Brute with the 2-handed kind of, it's like a giant meat cleaver. It's a ridiculous weapon. It would never work, but you get to upgrade to that, and it has pretty good stats. And so, while I think that gives you a little bit less value overall than using the Underworld's fighters, it's going to play the exact same way, which I think is going to be really valuable to have. And this kind of list gives you a lot of the kind of stronger options in Ironjawz, which is something really nice that a lot of the points drops that they had in the Tome of Champions gives you. The fact that you can, before, if you wanted to play some of the fancier Ironjawz, you really had to go down to 5 fighters, which doesn't really feel tenable for them because of their 3-inch move. It just doesn't feel like they cover enough of the board. They don't really have the ability that Stormcast has, where they can, that they have that similar really high toughness elite problem, but Stormcast can, they have these incredible artillery pieces, or they have flyers, or they have things that can make up for that. Ironjawz don't have that, so I think you really do want to have 6 at least in your warband. So this is one way to do it, is kind of having some, only 2 Ardboys and then just a lot of these really elite fighters, and then really leaning on Wa to get into position, and then using that one Gore-Grunta. The other way is really using the War Chanter, very similar to what you could get out of a Start Collecting box. You can drop the Gore-Grunta with the Pig Iron Choppa down, or the boss down to the regular one, and then that lets you upgrade an Ardboy to the Brute, and the Brute gets a little bit more out of the War Chanter. It kind of you're kind of spreading out your damage potential, which I think can be valuable, so that you don't just lose to a net, basically. The Gore-Grunta boss is really interesting as a piece in Ironjawz because it's probably the strongest leader in a vacuum. The issue is that Wa is so important that having, if your Gore-Grunta boss is your only leader, having Wa attached to your leader means that that's your only mobile deployment group, which can be really difficult to deal with, right? So you, for you, not for your opponent. So in my opinion, you really want to have a pig rider, in a deployment group, not with someone who has access to Wa. So you either need to be running your Gore-Grunta boss with another leader, or you have to downgrade it, which is too bad because the Gore-Grunta boss is really, really solid. Overall, Ironjawz are kind of weird in a competitive setting. So they're really difficult to make work consistently because you're going to have certain auto loss situations, especially against competitive warbands. However, they're so good in combat once they get into combat that you have the ability to steal a lot of games. A lot of the time, certain mission types that put you right in combat right away, the move to 4 rounds, which lets you kind of leverage the fact that you're dealing so much more damage in round 2 and 3 because your fighters haven't quite died yet and they're still fighting at full capacity. You can really leverage some of that to steal games, even against really solid warbands sometimes. The problem is just your auto loss situation. So consistency is so rough that Ironjawz are just in a weird place where I would say for bringing them to a tournament and winning a 4-round tournament, I'd say they're very, very bad. But in terms of playing your buddies, even if your buddies really like competitive warbands, you can still get some wins with Ironjawz because they're so good at stealing certain games and certain mission types. Casually, narrative play, I think Ironjawz are great. They've got sort of, the people who love Ironjawz really love them. There's sort of a cult of this faction. That shouldn't really affect this grade, though. In general, I would say, I haven't even talked about the Mega Boss yet, which I think a lot of people love. Allying the Brugit in with a Mega Boss is obviously an incredible meme. There's sort of a lot of different things you can play with Ironjawz as far as your different leaders and your different options. Both of those 2 Underworld's warbands, right, gives you lots of great options. And then their playstyle, even when it's not competitive in certain missions, you get auto losses in certain missions, it's extremely memorable, and I think that makes them excellent in any kind of casual setting. Kruleboyz. Kruleboyz are one of the crazier factions in the game. Starting off just on a budget, the Dominion half of Kruleboyz can get you into the game pretty well. It's going for anywhere between $65 and $70 on eBay, usually cheaper than 70, usually closer to the mid 60s, but I listed it here at 68 because that's just the first hit that was there when I looked for it. But there's a bajillion offerings out there anytime you do it, because those Dominion boxes, there's still so many in LGSs. I would start off playing the Killaboss on the Great GnashedTeeth. This is one that's kind of a controversial pick. I've covered it in a few videos. Basically, the base is just so damn big that it can be hard to use it effectively in a lot of games. But when the table terrain sort of cooperates with you, you can really do a lot of exciting stuff. It's a really incredible fighter when the table terrain cooperates with you. And its ability is really amazing. It pumps out a ton of damage. It's a very difficult piece to kill. It's just a classic, one of those fighters where when it's on the board, the whole game revolves around it. So, obviously you'll have a hit and miss time with it, but your hits are going to be great. Then I'd play a Swamp Kala Shaman, 3 Gut Rippers with Wicked Stickas, 3 Hobgrot Slitters, and the Wicked Sticka is the spear, basically. It's just, it's the only one that comes in the Dominion box. 3 Hobgrots and 1 Potgrot. I've actually played this list a couple times because I have the Dominion half of Kruleboyz. I would say, when I say here that there's a lot of non-obvious internal synergy, what I mean is that there's not a lot of combos between the units here. However, their roles complement each other very well. The Gut Rippers don't do much damage, but they are very hard to kill, and they're very good for engaging the enemy. If you have the option, I would go with the 1-inch reach melee, because they do a little bit more damage, and Gut Rippers want to be going within 1 inch to get base to base and tie an opponent up. They don't want to be holding them at range anyway, because they're so good on defense. But sort of moving them forward to engage the enemy, same with your 1 Potgrot, and then using your Swamp Kala Shaman's debuff to kind of make it harder to get through them, and then just like shooting away with your Hobgrots can be very, very effective. Effective at a lower power level. It's not extremely powerful, but the pieces work together very well, and I could not recommend this warband enough for casual play. Obviously you're not going to beat really competitive warbands with it, but for casual play, it runs beautifully. If you are going to go competitive, you very much can do it with Kruleboyz, but it's really weird. So one, Potgrots, whether you can source a lot of Potgrots or not, I don't know. As far as I know, there's only one person in the world with enough Potgrots to make these two lists, these two competitive lists that I've got here. But I think it's worth talking about them because they, at least this first one, Cutthroat Pacifism, I've called it, offers a really compelling and unique playstyle. You can put 10 Potgrots in a list with a bunch of the Underworld stuff that just came out for Kruleboyz, and then just 1 Swamp Kala Shaman. And you can, on any kind of objective or area control mission, you can completely overwhelm your opponent's ability to kill anything. You've got 2 different nets here in Torka Tough Skull and Shank. Your 1 damaging piece, Manok Dekunin, has 2-inch range, so he can go in, fight, and then it's hard for them to attack him back effectively. And then you have this Swamp Kala Shaman for this area debuff, along with Potgrots, which are just so impossibly hard to get through, right? And you've got 10 of these darn Potgrots, so you've got the full maximum of 15 fighters here to work with. There's just going to be certain mission types where you might only get 1 kill or 2 kills, but you will still win because you'll just like completely stop them from being able to get any real meaningful offense going. Some people are going to find that really annoying to play against, but I think it's cool that it at least exists, and especially cool that, it exists, but it's difficult to put together, because, this is a very memorable list if you ever get to put it on the table. There's really nothing else in the game that really plays like it. A more traditional sort of Tome of Champions template list for Kruleboyz would be bringing back the Killaboss on Great GnashedTeeth, just rolling the dice that you'll be able to make it effective despite the terrain, and then bringing in Manok Dekunin, Torka Tough Skull, 2 Hobgrot Slitters for their ranged explosions, and then Shank. the introduction of Underworlds, I think, has really revolutionized this faction in terms of your access to 2 different nets. One of the nets actually being on a pretty decent fighter in Torka. And then having 6 Potgrots, just to have 2 in every deployment group so that you've got your chaff, you've got your walls to stop your opponent. This is still a 12 fighter list, so you are just really swarming here. You can definitely get a little bit more mileage by replacing the Killaboss with the Maniac Boar Boss if you're using allies. But basically, you're just sort of putting threats all over the place in terms of you have your Killaboss, you have Manok, who's a legitimate threat, and then Torka plus backup, I think, also really counts as a threat. Torka actually fights really well. And then just kind of winning the objective missions with the Potgrot. This is just a much more traditional way to just spam chaff. And I think it would be pretty effective, again, without the ally to give your Potgrots extra movement. There is kind of a ceiling on what Kruleboyz can do, but I do think that they would be pretty effective. So overall, on Kruleboyz, I would say competitively, they're good if you don't have allies. They're great if you're allowing allies, because the way that you can bring in an Ironjawz or a Bonesplitterz to kind of pump their movement really helps them. This is a faction that, aside from Potgrots, they don't really have any options that really thrill you. So casually and in narrative play, I would really only say that they're solid, because a lot of their fighters are kind of underwhelming and hard to use effectively. The one thing, though, is that this new Underworlds warband, I mean, this is the options that you get out of this Underworlds warband, I think, really revolutionize Kruleboyz, and I think it's too early to say that it's made them really amazing in casual play, but I think the possibility is there, and I think anyone who really likes this faction should be really excited about that possibility. So Gloomspite Gitz. This is a really exciting faction in a ton of ways. So first, let's talk about them in a budget sense. I would just get a box of Squig Hoppers. It's $55. You get a Squig Hopper boss, Boingrot Bounder boss, Squig Hopper, Boingrot Bounder, and then you can convert any of those riders into just a regular Stabba, because they come with little knives, so they can just be a Stabba, and that can just round out this really nice tight list here. One other great way to get them on a budget is if your local game store still has old Underworld stuff. Zarbag's Gitz is 980 points just as an Underworld warband, and that's an awesome option for playing Gloomspite Gitz really cheaply. Both of these are going to make for really fun lists. The all Squig Hopper one, these kind of all flyer, all scary stuff lists, some people really love them, love the kind of idea of these super elite ones. Ever since the Thundercats list did well at Adepticon, people have been obsessed about these kind of hyper elite flyer lists. They could get a little old to play against, I think, depending, especially when they're made of really good flyers like Squig Hoppers. But, your mileage is going to vary there. Competitively, though, is where Gloomspite Gitz really shine, which is great to see since in AOS at the moment they're so bad. My approach with them would be to start with a Squig Hopper boss, one of the kind of classic dragons in the game. And then I'd go with a Boingrot Bounder and a Squig Hopper. The reason I'd have a Boingrot Bounder, I know generally Squig Hoppers have the better reputation. The way that Tome of Champions is set up right now, your hammer kind of starts, it's either not very important or it starts like right in the thick of things where it just needs to win fights. And the Boingrot Bounder just being a little bit more durable and having that 2-inch reach, I think is going to help you in those missions where your opponent starts right up in your grill. And that's kind of what happens to your hammer in the Tome of Champions sometimes. So I would say that, in the current situation, I would say that the Boingrot Bounder is just a little bit better suited to the type of gameplay that you have in your hammer. And then I'd have a Squig Hopper in my dagger, and then I'd have a Netter in every deployment group, and then a Shuda and Snurk Sourtongue. Snurk is the fanatic that came with Zarbag's Gitz. Comes with, he's, drinking some potion, and he's got like a ball and chain that he whirls around. So, the extra inches of reach there, and just an incredible amount of damage output on Snurk. Now, Snurk is very killable. It's very easy for your opponent to blow Snurk up before he really gets to do anything. The thing about that is, though, if they're devoting a ton of resources to that, you have these 3 squigs that are just like completely taking over the game. And so if your opponent is trying to do everything they can to mop up Snurk, you're probably winning that game because your 3 squig riders are just going to be so powerful. So I think your opponent really has to be thinking about them first, and that can really allow Snurk to kind of get in there and do some really scary stuff. Gloomspite Gitz, it's one of those factions. We still have pretty low sample size in the competitive Warcry scene, but Gloomspite Gitz are proven at this point. We have this Riley from Swolehammer went 4-0 at Adepticon with Gloomspite using a Squig Hopper boss, 3 Squig Hoppers, and 3 Netters. Just like real simple, real clean, and just, dominant performance. We also, some buddies of mine, you can check them out on the Tabletop and Beyond podcast. They ran a little game day, 4-person round robin, and this Gloomspite Gitz list with Boingrot Bounder and Squig Hopper, a bunch of Netters, and then Snurk getting bonus attacks from a Brewgit, went and just crushed everyone at their little game day, right? Because just the combination of the flyers, the nets, and then this like explosive damage out of Snurk. Gloomspite were already really good, but it just seems like you can really leverage the Zarbek's Gitz is mostly pretty bad, other than just the upgraded Netter and this one Fanatic. So I would say it's given a whole new dimension to a faction that didn't even really need it. So really strong, a ton of stuff you can do with Gloomspite. Competitively, they're just an excellent force. Something where you should probably be thinking about Gloomspite for any tournament, because it seems like people really like them. People bring them a lot, and they're also really, really good. So I would say they're kind of turning into one of the gatekeepers of the game. Casually and in narrative play, I think they're also still very good. They have a bajillion options. You can build around any of the different Gobapalooza units. They have a ton of different leader options to choose from. The only thing I would want to say as a caveat, and this might even be a thing, you might even think this is a benefit, is not every option is very good. And some of the things you can, Gloomspite are incredible in a competitive sense, but it's easy to build a terrible Gloomspite list. There's a lot of spider themed things in Gloomspite that are all pretty horrible. They have a lot of foot heroes that you can use as your leader that are fun but pretty horrible. So there's a lot of ways to trap yourself with list building with Gloomspite, but there's still just like anything that involves squigs is going to be really solid. And even down to the people who have these little trained squigs on leashes, the mushroom hunters, they're pretty solid, even though they would never sniff any of these competitive lists. So there's just a lot of exploration space with Gloomspite, which I think makes them very good. Just be aware that you might trap yourself into something pretty bad. Ogor Mawtribes. This is the last destruction faction to cover today, and on a budget, I forgot to put the Leadbelcher box price here, but just that box gives you a ton of options because it comes with 6 Gnoblars, which is crazy. So you can go with a Thunderfist and 2 Leadbelchers and then 6 Gnoblars, and that is a really tight, really competitive list. That might be the second best, and it even might give the number one. I would say the Plague Monk box is probably my number one single box warband, or like single cheap box warband. This might give it a run for its money. It might be on the same level. Just having those 3 artillery pieces and then 6 Gnoblars to have plenty of chaff. It also fits the TOC template really, really well. This box also includes a few melee weapons, so if you want to, if you're not going to try to collect Ogor Mawtribes as an AOS army, you can just turn the last Ogre into a Glutton really easily, and then, you have a melee option if you want it, so that's really cool. Competitively, Ogor Mawtribes really shine. They have kind of, at this point, it's a pretty well-known thing that you can do with them, where you can just have two Thunder Fists, and their ability lets you, once you kill something, you get to make a bonus attack action. Bonus actions are always good. The Thunder Fist then gets to be the most incredibly efficient way of blowing up chaff in the game, and having two of them can often just leave, you know, your chaff spam opponent with nothing but their elites by the end of round one, and that can just give you this massive advantage on a lot of objective missions, stuff like that. And even on hunter missions, you know, range is just generally good anyway. So even if you're not blowing off chaff, you know, at least you're just shooting stuff, right? And they kind of have to come to you, and then you have this wall of Gnoblars. So ogres are really, really effective. One thing you can do with this competitive double Thunder Fist list is you can drop 4 of the Gnoblars for a second Yeti. Some people really swear by Yetis. I think they're pretty good. They have that ability to get an extra move as long as something's within 6 inches of them, which is just a generally amazing ability. That, yeah, always good whenever it's in play. This way, also in this list, you've got, you know, 1 Thunder Fist in 2 deployment groups, your Yeti in another one. So you have not just threats, but like power projection in every deployment group. So this is a very serious list that, you know, is a threat. If you bring this list, you're absolutely a threat to win your tournament, and you should be considered one of the people to beat. A more kind of maybe slightly less competitive edge, but still a really hard, more casual list is, and a little bit fluffier too. If you take Hrothgorn Mantrapper, that's the unique Underworld's Icebrow Hunter. And if you include Thrafnir and Frost Saber, and then you have Quiv, and then you have a Gorger, and then, you know, Bushwhacker plus 2 Gnoblars. I was going to call this like 100-hand slap, like E Honda and Street Fighter, but it's also kind of helping hand slaps, right? Because the theme of this list is everything gives something else bonus actions. This is an incredible way to have fairly elite fighters, right? You've got your Icebrow Hunter, which is this 300-point monster, and then you've got you know, 3 different like pretty heavy hitters in the 2 Frost Sabers and the Gorger, but all of them are getting bonus actions, right? So Quiv can give Hrothgorn an extra attack. Hrothgorn can give Thrafnir or the Frost Saber an extra attack, and then the Gorger can give itself, it has the same ability that Yetis do, where it can give itself an extra move. Now, it's not as strong on the Gorger because the Gorger only moves 5 inches instead of 8, but it's still really strong, and the Gorgers are just incredible in combat. So this is a list that, you know, you might not be flooding the board. I think you only have 8 fighters here, but your number of actions is going to be much higher and much more effective than it would look based on how many people you've got fighting here. So just a really cool kind of combo list that you can build out of Ogor Mawtribes. I would love to try this. It would take a lot to track down all the pieces, I'm not gonna lie, between the you know, the Hrothgorn Underworld set and then getting Frost Sabers and Gorgers. It would take a little while to put this together, but all of the abilities really jump on top of each other in a pretty big way here. So overall, competitively, Ogor Mawtribes are just excellent. They're one of the sort of classic competitive warbands. You don't see, at least we haven't so far seen very many of them in tournaments. Last year there were some doing really well in a Polish tournament. Then there's also been, you know, a little bit of lower tier sort of performances from them. People tend not to trip, fall, and find the really powerful stuff in Ogor Mawtribes. You know, there's a lot of the time when you see them in a competitive setting, at least like when I saw them at Adepticon, it would be like a bunch of the melee ogres, which are still pretty solid, but will struggle in a lot of kind of missions where you have to be going around the board. So I would say because of all those options, they're really good in casual play. You just need to know that some of them are kind of traps. A lot of people like to avoid Gnoblars because they don't really feel fluffy within the faction to be basing it around Gnoblars, because this is, you know, ogres. That will kind of put you in a different place competitively, but that can be okay. And you can still play pretty effective no or low Gnoblar lists. For example, if you drop 4 Gnoblars in this competitive list for a second Yeti, I think you're giving up some value there, but Yetis have a ton of play to them, and getting another one on the board is not a bad thing. So you're still going to have 3 Gnoblars, 1 for each deployment group, and then 4 really scary threats. So there are some things you can do with low numbers of Gnoblars, but in general that's going to be a big part of what you do with Ogor Mawtribes. So that's it for destruction. We've run through everything there is to destroy. Destruction is one of the smaller ones, but really fun and really memorable, with 2 extremely competitive options and 1, you know, speculatively competitive option in Kruleboyz. So I hope you like it. I'm going to continue on, you know, doing these list videos, and until then, may all your rolls be crits.